we want to thank everyone who's helped to make today a possibility, and that includes first Erin, the Newton Wellesley Hospital. Newton is always a wonderful partner with us, and Erin is always gracious and goes far beyond in helping us to put these events together. Thank you also to our panelists who are here today, 3 of them who have come from the Berkshires to be with us and share their expertise in this area. As Erin mentioned, over the past 2 years, we've held 3 domestic violence roundtables that have dealt with the intersection between family violence and the abuse of animals. And whenever we do that, we look to see who's there, and isn't it wonderful that we're sharing this information with these people, but also who is not here, who's missing from the table that should be joining in our partnership in this area. And what we saw was that at each of those roundtables, there was a very large representation from the victim community, those that probably see this most often and perhaps understand it best. But what we wanted to do was start raising awareness of this issue in other communities. Because what we have found is if you look at what we do in the DA's office as a spectrum, from prevention to prosecution, that place in the middle is occupied by intervention. And intervention is born of awareness of what to look for and what to do when you see it. And that's what we are trying to do today in talking about this area. And also the people that really, because of their positions, many of you here today, animal control officers, elder services workers, because of your position, you're on the front line. You are the person who's going to see this problem. And if we can arm you with what you're looking for, where to go, then we are successful. Now, as the DA, Jerry Leone has really tried to focus on what we call the BAD. What are the barriers against disclosure, particularly with respect to, in this case, domestic violence? And those barriers find their roots in many unique things: cultural situations, financial situations, societal implications. And by their nature, those things prevent people from going forward. Whether it's their young children, they can't afford to go, any of those things. And what we've begun to see more and more is that pets have become, in many cases, a barrier against disclosure. The abuse of the family pet prevents the victim from leaving a situation where either she or her children might also be being abused, because they don't want to abandon the pet, and they don't have a way to get the pet out of that situation. And one very clear example we had of that was the case of Montero Green that we prosecuted, that Suzanne Ponce, who's the chief of our domestic violence unit, prosecuted. And in that case, the defendant was convicted ultimately of 19 indictments, including indictments for attempted murder, for stalking, and for animal cruelty. That defendant, in part of his abuse of the victim, had been to torture her pets. He had killed her, bludgeoned and killed her cat. He threw her dog from the 2nd floor, and he on one occasion strangled that dog until it actually defecated. And she was reluctant to leave because she had nowhere to go that she could take the pet with her. She knew if she left the pets there, they would be the subject to more abuse. We see it often in the arena that many of you are familiar with, the individuals who are looking for a civil restraining order. Those individuals will describe to us a situation of violence in their home when they're contemplating fleeing, but again, they can't go because they can't take the dog or the cat, whatever the family pet is. And in elder abuse, we see it particularly because very often, as many of you know, work with the elder community, that pet has really become their most important companion. And the family members either will also abuse the pet, or they're threatening to do something to the pet. And that is a very effective way of keeping people silent. It's a very effective way of getting them to put up with abuse of themselves in some cases in order not to subject that pet to further torture. So today, what you're really going to talk, our presenters are going to talk about is some of the ways that that happens. Many of you will see things that you've seen in your work in that. And they're also, more importantly, going to be offering you some very effective intervention strategies. You're going to learn how the MSPCA can play a supportive role in the investigation and the prosecution of those cases. You'll learn about the work that Dr. Lorna Grande and her team at Haven are doing to raise awareness. So on behalf of the DA, I want to thank you for being here. We look forward to being with you for the next couple of hours, really learning from this and working together as we go forward with these cases. And I mentioned that Dr. Bandy would be talking about her work, and particularly her work with Haven, but she brings a very long history with this work to what she tells you today. Even prior to attending veterinary school, Dr. Bandy was a humane educator for the Mass Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And it was through working with families and their pets that she began to get some insight into how pets become involved in the dynamic of family violence. She went on to graduate from the Tufts University School of Veterinary Medicine and began working in animal shelters over 30 years ago, continuing to do that work today. She serves now on the faculty of Veterinary and Animal Sciences Department at UMass Amherst and is the coordinator of Haven, the Human Animals Violence Education Network.
And gone out on complaints in which we've learned, this is not one, this is many, where a victim has changed her behavior, and I use the pronoun her because it's typically a female that's getting abused and a male that's doing the abusing. Not necessarily, but that's the stereotypical pattern at least. But the victim anticipates harm to the animal, and in anticipation of that harm, changes her behavior. And one of the classic forms is where she simply does not report. She knows what's going on, but she makes the actuarial determination in advance that to report something is going to be worse for her than not reporting. And so she declines to report either abuse to herself or to the animal. As you've also heard, and we do see this, where the victim does not want to leave because she can't care for the animals where she's going, and or she doesn't want to leave the animals where they are. And she fears for that animal or those animals. All of these things are worsened if there is in fact not just anticipated abuse, but as more commonly is the case, where there's actual abuse. And this is perhaps ground zero, where the defendant injures an animal or threatens to injure an animal, or sometimes combines them, injures and then threatens more injury in order to bribe or threaten or extort a change in behavior, whatever it is. Do this, don't do this, don't go out, don't call him, whatever it is, to extract a change in behavior from the victim. And we have seen cases where, or at least heard allegations, they're sometimes difficult to prove, where a defendant will kill or injure an animal just as a general warning, as a shot across the bow, if you will. We have seen some cases where a defendant will hold an animal. Sometimes an abuser will separate, but keep an animal and use that to extract something. Like, get back together with me and I'll share the animal, which tends not to work, but we have seen that variant. And we have seen in investigated cases where an abuser will simply kill an animal as revenge. And there have been a couple cases in the last few years where an abuser will leave the house but leave his animals with the victim, demand treatment of various forms, but then prohibit the victim from getting rid of the animals. Those are my dogs, those are my cattle, you cannot get rid of them. And by the way, you really should be feeding them. And I'll get some hay to you soon. That is used to either manipulate or punish someone. Even, we've seen that a few times, even when the abuser is out of the house, and even if violence per se isn't used in that particular case. This is one example, and I've included excerpts from the victim's written statement, which I think captured all too well some of the dynamics here. Essentially, this came to us in several steps. The facts that were relevant were first released in an application for a 209A restraining order, and The reason it came to us is because it was revealed by the victim that the abuser, who became a criminal defendant, killed the victim's cat. And what happened was the victim's young cat was running around and doing what young cats do, and the defendant was getting agitated, told her to put the cat outside. The cat kept coming back in, and eventually the defendant grabbed the cat, grabbed a knife, took the cat outside, and stabbed it repeatedly. Autopsy did confirm a lot of sharp force trauma, including 5 chest wounds, and the defendant buried the cat in the backyard. Here are some of the key statements that the victim wrote. She saw the stabbing. He came back into the house all bloody, and this is what caught my eye. He screamed for me to clean him up. So it's all about him. And then he threatened her that just like in the video that we saw previously, she'd get the same treatment if she reported that. And those are verbatim quotes from the letter. All of these scenarios can occur in elder abuse situations. There are a few others that we see. Sometimes where the animals and the elder in a house, especially an elder needing special care, receive the same sort of neglect. Not necessarily affirmative abuse, but where they all receive the same sort of neglect. And we do see hoarding cases there, and I want to make it clear, not all hoarders are elderly, and I use hoarders as a broad, I use it loosely as a broad term. But we have seen cases where sometimes an elder who is a hoarder subjects both himself and the animals to remarkable and remarkably unhealthy conditions that cause suffering by all of the creatures in the house. Mental health is often a component of these cases, and one of the things that we've used, particularly in hoarding cases, is in some cases we have used a social worker, of course with the person we're dealing with their consent, to help facilitate an understanding. And in some cases, select cases, that has actually worked nicely. In these hoarding cases, we make generalizations, but you can't always generalize. And it's important for you to recognize that in some of these hoarding cases, the person who is doing the hoarding exits into the regular world and wouldn't necessarily let you know by their behavior or dress or otherwise that there's a serious hoarding problem at home. These photos, which are clearly disgusting, were taken from a house where there was someone who lived there. She was working. Anyone care to guess what this person did for work? Shout them out. Take some guesses.
Nurse.
Wow. I thought you were going to have to guess for what? This person was a nurse. Did you know that in advance? Were you a juror?
I just think it was, it would have to be ironic.
Well, we have someone who's either very lucky or is our nation's next Sherlock Holmes. That was right on. Okay. So, one of the reasons this matters is that, as you've heard, where there's smoke, there's fire. Sometimes, if you see one problem or find one problem, you can find others, whether it's domestic violence leading you to animal abuse or animal abuse leading you to elder abuse. Sometimes one facet of a multifaceted problem may be your portal in to help. And taking steps in that direction, if you're helping one part of a problem, you may end up helping other parts. You should recognize that not every case is prosecutable. Some cases cannot be proven. And we at the MSPCA do take a problem-solving approach. And sometimes that means working with people and holding hands a little bit in order to get a problem solved in lieu of court, or at least before court. Because what we have found is that if we do try working with someone and it doesn't work, and we do need to go to court, it positions us nicely in some cases, because when a defendant says, oh, look at this, they're rushing to judgment, they're looking to hang me out to dry, we can then say, actually, no, we did try working with this person doing A, B, C, D, E, etc. Here's some, I think I have about 10 minutes. I appreciate your patience. Here are a few things that you may find as possible red flags. It's important to recognize that any of the things that you may see or that I may mention aren't necessarily or per se indicators of animal abuse. They may be. You have to look at these as stars in a constellation. One of them isn't necessarily abuse. You have to look at the entire picture. But that said, failure to provide a sanitary environment where it's grossly unkept. Certainly multiple animals. And in the case of trauma, certainly signs of physical abuse like bruising or bleeding, particularly where bruising or bleeding is limited to one part of the body. There are some rat poisons that can cause bleeding problems, but that causes bleeding everywhere, not in one part of the body. They won't cause bruising shaped like a recognizable object. And one slide that I've included, here you can see scleral hemorrhage. The sclera is the white part of the eye. And when an animal suffers traumatic, intentional injury, they often get it around the face or the head. Either initially or when they go to retaliate and they turn to face, they often will get belted in the face or head if that's what you're dealing with. And because of the hair coat of animals, it's often hard to appreciate that. However, the sclera of the eye, white eye, you can probably appreciate it looks like it's red stained painted. It's not the tree-like little branching veins that you see in a bloodshot eye. It looks like it's been painted. That's consistent with trauma. That's one thing that you may see. You may see skin injuries, burns, lacerations, especially if you see areas that are healing at different stages. Once again, because animals sometimes get trauma in the face, sometimes you'll see a broken tooth or dental injuries. Sudden lameness, although you have to be careful, there are a lot of causes for that. A contaminated wound, an improperly healed fracture, which you may not appreciate unless a veterinarian tells you so, but that's something. And a history of unexplained traumatic injuries. Certainly, not every injury is explained, but if you see a history of serial unexplained traumatic injuries, that's something that might at least catch your ear. Dog fighting does occur. Typically, you will see puncture-like or punctate injuries, classically along the chest, front of the legs, jowls, face. Sometimes you see it in the hind legs. Those are consistent with the dog fight, and sometimes dogs just fight. But if you see that, that's at least something that should catch your eye. When you're talking to people, sometimes people, if you talk to a respondent or defendant, sometimes they'll just tell you. Not all the time, it's rare, but sometimes people will at least make a partial admission. Or sometimes they'll admit to being in a certain place without admitting to what they've done. Changing stories or accounts, for those of you that are police officers, this shouldn't be news to you. Or giving you an explanation that's inconsistent with what you're observing and clearly know. Or the second grader response, not knowing facts that reasonably should be known.